Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for the nice introduction. My name is Isabella, as folks have mentioned, and I will be the moderator for our next session. Regulation, legislation, ranking in AI for human rights. I'd like to give the welcome, my fellow panelists. I will jump straight up on questions because we already have a great introduction. If people are okay with that, I would love to start this conversation with Isabel. With Isabel. Could you start, like, first to set the scene, right? Like, could you explain to us what are the implications of AI on human rights?
Thank you very much, Isabella. I hope you can hear me okay. I had to change devices. Yes, thanks. So sorry for the strange angle. My name is Isabel Ebert. I represent the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I work at a project called BTech. We work on advancing human rights in the technology sector. And we have just published last November a taxonomy that shows human rights harms that can be connected with generative AI. Of course, generative AI is a very specific type of artificial intelligence, but many type of intelligence that is considered as artificial now moves towards generative AI. I'm going to make a few examples from this taxonomy, which is also publicly available. So, for example, AI can cause psychological and physical harm. So images and video generators can be used to create non-consensual sexualized content, for example. That can include synthetic sexualized depictions of real or non-consenting individuals, so-called deep fake pornography, or it can also depict violent sexual imagery. And also in that, on that side note, there's also a higher risk for the creation of child abuse sexual material. And in all cases, unfortunately, also women and children are of heightened risks. Also with regard to freedom from discrimination, as many of you are aware, outputs of generative AI models have often overrepresented culturally hegemonic groups that can be white, Western male, heterosexual, cisgender, and those who benefit of legacies of colonialism and so forth. And this may in turn lead to misrepresentation or underrepresentation of other groups at scale. Another concern relates to the right to privacy. So, for example, users may input private or sensitive information into generative AI models to generate prompts, but they may not fully understand how their data will then be collected, stored, and used. And this data is often used to retrain the models, and it is unclear to what extent such sensitive information could reappear in subsequent hallucinations as outputs to users. So these are just a few very specific examples what can happen. I mean, generally speaking, a lot of bias and reinforcement of negative stereotypes can be an issue. It might negatively impact vulnerable groups. And as we have heard also from Timnit before, of course, in the military context, a lot of these biases and lack of accuracy can have lethal consequences. So it's an area of heightened risk. And on that note, I mean, what we evidently as the UN Human Rights Office preach is that human rights need to inform the risk management with regard to generative AI, that it needs to be embedded in generative AI. A few of the speakers will probably touch on that. And we say that the International Human Rights Framework is really the model to follow in terms of developing regulatory approaches, in terms of also putting at the center the severity of risk to people, and also the expectations towards companies to respect rights. I'm happy to go on, but I think you want to jump to other panelists.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that overview. Yes, it's quite important. And I wanted to jump, if it's okay, to Meredith, because I would like to hear how could legislation such as the European AI Act can help with the types of problems that Isabel described.
Thanks, Isabella, and it's really a pleasure to share this space with you all today. And as we can see from such an extensive list of possible and actual harms, as outlined by Isabel, it's clear that self-regulation for tech is no longer a viable option. This is especially apparent now when the ICJ has cautioned about plausible genocide taking place in Gaza, and tech companies are remaining silent about their role. States need to come in to set the standards for what companies are required to do to ensure that they're not facilitating violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center, for context, sent a survey to 104 tech companies operating in or providing services to Israel or Palestine, requesting more information about their heightened human rights due diligence practices. Only 3 companies, Ericsson, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and TikTok, responded in detail with specific answers to our survey questions. Meta responded, but not to our questions directly. And this astonishingly low 4% response rate is unprecedented in the Resource Center's history. And it's a horrible reflection of the sector's commitment to transparency and engagement with civil society. We sent nearly the same survey to tech companies about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the response rate in that instance was 26%. So, circling back to Isabella's question, we need new legislation. And the EU has been making some important strides in this regard, including the AI Act, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the Digital Services Act, among others. And they certainly aren't perfect, but they do represent progress, especially in comparison to the US, which is lagging behind. For example, the EU AI Act is a critical first step towards mandating fundamental rights assessments in regards to downstream impacts of AI systems. But the scope is limited by some significant carve-outs for military, defense, or national security purposes. And something else that's important to mention for this audience is that the Act does not stop EU-based companies from exporting AI systems, which are banned in the EU because they pose unacceptable levels of risk. So this means that there's still a substantial risk that EU tech can continue to facilitate human rights harms in non-EU countries. And Algorithm Watch has a really great analysis about this, of all of the positive and negatives that I can post into the chat. The Research Center was also heavily involved in advocating for the tech sector to have greater scrutiny within the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And this CS3D mandates stakeholder engagement, grievance mechanisms, and remediation measures. And it applies across all sectors, including tech. But here too, the number of tech companies impacted is not as comprehensive as we would have hoped. For example, tech startups producing problematic AI systems are not included within the scope of the CS3D. So I say this to point out that even as we layer these different pieces of legislation on top of each other, the GDPR, the CS3D, the AI Act, there are still holes. But even given all of these gaps, there are some really important changes that are taking place which can help with addressing some of the harms that Isabel mentioned that are linked to AI. So I would kind of summarize these into 3 main buckets. The first is that fundamental rights impact assessments and human rights due diligence are now one step closer to becoming normalized within the tech sector. The CS3D mandates due diligence across the value chain, and fundamental rights impact assessments will be required for deployers of AI systems in the EU. And these are huge wins that cannot be overstated. And we want to see these trends replicated in different regions. The second is that more people are expecting, demanding, and can now better claim their right to more transparency when it comes to the use of AI systems and technologies that are impacting them. One example is that the EU AI Act is creating a publicly accessible database to have transparency about which high-risk AI systems are being deployed in the EU. And more broadly, improved due diligence requirements and improved disclosure for companies means that others outside of the EU will be able to use that information to fuel their advocacy campaigns for equal considerations in other jurisdictions in which these same companies are operating. And lastly, an important change is that more human rights related material risk that investors should be paying attention to, namely those investors who are pumping money into undercooked and problematic technologies and AI systems, as Dr. Debreu had mentioned, some of the problematic trends within venture capital. It's increasingly possible now for regulators to fine tech companies millions for failing to take human rights due diligence more seriously. And increased transparency means that reputational risk is also on the rise for failing to take human rights due diligence more seriously. And as tech workers become more active in fighting for human rights within their tech companies, operational risk increases. And operational risk is when engineers refuse to continue developing technologies, or offices become occupied, or investigations cause operational delays and divert human resources. So to wrap up, I foresee that many more important cases related to tech's facilitation of human rights harms will be arising over the coming years, and especially as this type of legislation is concretized in more countries, including outside of the EU, like in Brazil. And these pieces of legislation are critical for helping to break cycles of impunity and stop the replication of the same harms that we're seeing tech companies involved in across jurisdictions.
Thank you so much. That's great. And yes, I think there's still some holes where it is awakening some things on people for especially to know what to look for, and also that is a fear of hurting the pocket of the companies, right? Like when investors are also knowing what to look for and what to demand before making an investment on such companies. I would like to jump now to James. James, I know that the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence is not necessarily a piece of legislation, but could you share how was the process to create it? Like what was considered essential steps as to build the recommendation?
Sure, and yeah, hi everyone. It's great to be on this panel. Thanks a lot to the organisers of the forum. So perhaps it's helpful if I start by just very briefly introducing the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI to anyone who might not be familiar with it. So the recommendation was adopted in 2021 by all 193 of our UNESCO member states. At the time, it's now 194 with the US having rejoined. And that makes it the only globally agreed normative standard in the domain of AI ethics to date. It's made up of 4 high-level values: the respect, protection and promotion of human rights, human dignity and fundamental freedoms. That's really at the heart of the recommendation. Also environment and ecosystem flourishing, ensuring diversity and inclusiveness, and living in peaceful, just and interconnected societies. And then those 4 high-level values are broken down into 10 principles. So things like safety and security, proportionality and do no harm, fairness and non-discrimination, and so on. So I'm sure you're extremely familiar with these kinds of principles, but I think what really sets the UNESCO recommendation apart from other ethical frameworks, and as you'll know, there are many hundreds of these ethical frameworks, is not just the fact that it's actually the only globally agreed ethical framework, but also that it goes beyond just the values and principles to also set out concrete actions to be taken across different policy areas in chapters like there's a chapter on data policy, gender, environment and ecosystems, and so on. And it also includes several key provisions, including banning the use of AI for mass surveillance, social scoring, similar to the EU AI Act, a prohibition on giving AI legal personality, legal rights, and also a requirement for final human determination in high-risk life or death areas. So to get to your question about the actual process for how it was developed, the process took about 2 years. There was a draft text that was produced with the assistance of our ad hoc expert group, and it drew on an earlier preliminary study by UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology, COMEST. That initial process involved inclusive, multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder consultations, which were really important to ensure that the text was going to be as inclusive as possible. That was the initial phase for drafting, and then the focus shifted to an intensive phase of intergovernmental negotiations on that draft text to produce the final version of the recommendation, which was then adopted in late 2021. I wasn't actually with UNESCO during the process of creating the recommendation. I've heard a lot of stories from my colleagues about just how tough that process was. Mainly tough because it involved intensive rounds of negotiations with all of our member states. But I think this is really vital because member states really had an active hand in shaping the final recommendation. And I think it's contributed to a sense of ownership. So this isn't like an external framework that's been imposed on countries. It's a framework that's been shaped together with countries. So I think there's real buy-in. And just to end, this is just a recommendation to member states. It isn't, as you said, a piece of legislation. There's no kind of enforcement mechanism, but there is a requirement for member states to report on their progress in implementing the recommendation on a regular basis. I think it's every 4 years, and it should be happening next year. And we're currently working with almost 60 member states on supporting their implementation efforts, including Palestine, which I'll get onto. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. I wanted to now talk a little bit with Tash. And Mary did touch a little bit on this, right? Like on the reasons why companies should be complying with such legislations, right? Like, but I wonder, Tash, why sometimes the compliance of the private sector to legislations, such as the European AI Act, is so slow? What is the internal process of a data company to comply with such legislation? Are there any reasons? Why is it slow?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me very well?
Yes.
I'm a bit sick today, so I'm going to try to do my best. Thank you very much. I think all of you said already a lot of information about how hard is to get together some, we would say in Spanish, protocolos, but it's so slow basically because on my experience and background as a software engineer, it's because when we talk about AI, everyone thinks they can use it, they can build it itself, but the problem most of the times is like there are a few companies who have really powerful models like OpenAI or big tech, who rules actually the AI world. So basically on legislation side, or what would say political side, everyone knows about AI. And this is a bit funny because I used to say nobody really knows what is doing or what it's about, but everyone is talking about AI. So most of the times what we face it in the European Parliament is there are so many people who work for lobbies for these big companies. Maybe they are only 5 or 6 companies who have really good reasons to stop this legislation. So most of the time, these lobbies goes to politicians, go to the parties in the European Parliament to give the advice or even to write the legislation. So I think one of the colleagues before been talking about this. So when you have to rule or when you have to do legislation about something that you don't really know, and there is no a lot of people who control about AI as in technical way in the public side. So of course these companies go to the EU Parliament or here in Spain to the Spanish Parliament and say, okay, we're going to help you to regulate this. We are really bad, so we're going to regulate ourselves. So this is basically the big issue we have in the European Parliament. We need to regulate the lobbies and then as well to regulate the AI. You hear me very well? I don't see you, so I think it's fine, isn't it? Yeah, sorry. So basically, we face this, and as you know, the Act was approved during the Spanish, like we'd say, presidency of the EU. But for me, and my opinion, was a bit fast. It was more a political goal, more than like, even though we have to say thank you, because at least we have something compared to the United States or compared to other countries. Even we, as a colleague said before, it even has like holes, like compares related to the human rights, related to biovigilancia and stuff like that we could not achieve. But we have a hope, we have an opportunity in each member of the United States to make more guarantee, to make a better law. So in our case, what we are doing is within this AI Act, but just as a base thing to make better laws or better policies. And basically, there is so much money. I would summarize it in: there is so much money, so much lobbying in the parliament, and there is no knowledge. We have a huge problem as well in the Spanish parliament or in the Spanish public service to bring the engineers, to bring what we say like the thinkers or the engineers to our side, because we are not competitive. Always we've been given to external companies, the software product, everything, we've been externalizing it. So we don't have this knowledge inside the public side. So a lot of times when we have to make regulation about digital things or about new software, we just give these companies the chance to do it and help us. So that is something we need to be scared about, because of course if we ask OpenAI to regulate their software, they're gonna not be 100% transparent at the end. So I think for me at least we need to have a huge we need to work in a huge way, not only to regulate, as well to teach people about technology, about the difference of AI, what can be good for us, and choose between all policymakers and public and citizens and organization, which is what we can get from all this technology. Not everything gonna be perfect or gonna apply to us or gonna be good for our society in the future. So I think we have a huge challenge on that, educating people and educating society, because a lot of times when I have to talk about AI or I have to talk about tech things, it's not even on political agenda or media agenda. They just think, oh, okay, this tech girl talking about tech things. So that is, I think, the best thing or the best advantage has these private companies compares to public and policymakers. I don't know if I summarize it very well, but I think we need more knowledge, more knowledge in public service, and because we are like a decade on behind of the public. And I think it's possible, because you can help doing regulation, but we always regulate US tech companies. We never put money on public digitalization process to have a competitive process compares these private companies. Sorry for my English.
No, my English too, so don't worry. I think like this is
actually.
I feel right, like it's complicated when there's so much power on a handful of companies, right? Like from the influence, it's also from the dependence. And you brought a really great point about also more investment in other other options, right? Like so there is other options for the people. Thank you so much. I think I want to talk a little bit. I want to go back to James, if that's okay, because I'm wondering also about the impact on the ground that you have seen so far with the work around implementing the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. Is there any resistance, or is being slow? How is that going?
Actually, I think quite the opposite. I mean, there's been a massive amount of interest. We recently had our kind of annual flagship event, the Global Forum on Ethics of AI, that was held in Slovenia. And, you know, the thing that we kept hearing is like governments really want support to be able to, you know, implement aspects of the recommendation and around things like new laws and regulations. So with in our UNESCO team, to support that implementation effort, we've developed what we call the Readiness Assessment Methodology, or the RAM for short. And that was, you know, part of the recommendation was that this readiness assessment tool should be created. The aim of that is to help member states understand how prepared they are to implement AI ethically and responsibly for all of their citizens. And it's intended to highlight, on the one hand, the kind of institutional and governance strengths to build on, as well as the gaps that exist, that we all know exist. And then enabling UNESCO to tailor its support for governments to address those gaps in order to ensure a kind of ethical AI ecosystem that's aligned with the UNESCO recommendation on ethics of AI. So the RAM that we've produced is basically a really long questionnaire that covers 5 different dimensions of the UNESCO recommendation. So there are questions about legal and regulatory dimension, so laws around AI, you know, AI strategy, data protection, cybersecurity, open data, all of that stuff. There's a social and cultural dimension, scientific and educational, economic, you know, levels of investment, public and private investment, and also a technological and infrastructural dimension. I won't go into like what all of those dimensions include, but the point is that it provides a really comprehensive view of the whole landscape around AI to identify these kind of areas of strengths and weaknesses that can be addressed. So at the moment, over 50 countries are conducting the RAM exercise. And that includes a kind of data gathering part where they're answering all of these qualitative and quantitative questions. Then a national public multi-stakeholder consultation exercise to get to grips with what are the policy priorities, national priorities, public concerns around AI and AI governance. And then we produce a country report which has kind of concrete policy recommendations to update national AI strategy in alignment with the UNESCO recommendation and its values and principles. So as I mentioned, the RAM is also underway in Palestine. We're currently in the final stages of completing that. And the country report should be launched in the next few months. I'm not going to preempt it by saying what's in the report, I'm afraid, but there's going to be a range of detailed recommendations for updating policies and laws relating to AI, as well as capacity building measures. And then that report launch is just the start. We then kind of work with member states to actually implement those recommendations in order to build an ethical AI ecosystem. And I just want to end by giving one concrete example of the kind of impacts of this process. So we recently launched the RAM report for Chile. It was launched by the president of Chile and our director general a month ago. And one of the recommendations was that the government should update and strengthen its cybersecurity and data protection laws to take account of AI and generative AI specifically. So drawing directly on that recommendation, the president of Chile recently enacted a new cybersecurity and critical infrastructure law, which was the first of its kind in Latin America, and specifically addressed the gaps that we'd identified through the RAM. We've got many countries completing the RAM this year, also piloting an ethical impact assessment tool for AI systems that we've developed. So we're really hoping to scale up some of these impacts as governments are really moving towards implementation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So it looks like the UNESCO recommendations are actually helping educate some of those legislators in the countries and guiding them into the decisions that they need to make. But we saw, right, like that, even with the legislations that exist already, the European Union AI Act, there are holes. We saw also, right, like we heard here from our fellow Panelists about how hard it is for even though there are multiple resources for convincing tech companies into following it, but sometimes the big ones that need to be convinced and the small ones depend on the technology, right, like for the solutions that they're building. So I want to go back to you, Isabel, because hearing all of this, like all these difficulties in the process, and I wonder these difficulties, what type of harms can this generate? Is there a point of no return where the development and use of AI might achieve where it's like too late to address the ethical issues it can create an harm to human rights? Are we like, would you consider that we have a point of no return where these technologies are already built out there and this type of interventions is too late to occur? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Isabella. I mean, of course, at the moment, we have this huge push towards regulation. Civil society is calling for it, governments are calling for it, some voices in business. And there's always this debate around what should we exactly regulate and why. And I think we see, I mean, certainly several camps, but two large camps that we can distinguish. On the one hand, the ones that talk about existential risk, the sort of point of no return, and on the other hand, the people that want to tackle the immediate harms and the actual harms that have been already materializing. And I think, I mean, as often the sweet spot is probably in between. We need to understand the current risks in order to be able to get a clearer picture and more accuracy around what might be happening 10 years from now. And evidently, a lot of the speakers have also spoken to a certain oligopolic power structure in the tech system. Certainly, there are many companies that are dominating the discourse. And that is also why it's so important to focus a lot on private sector responsibility in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is a standard that exists since 2011 and is aligned also with the multinational guidelines for the multinational enterprises at the OECD. And we work very closely together with the OECD also on their AI expert group. And the OECD is working on a due diligence guidance on AI and responsible business conduct. So it's lots of moving pieces in order to bring human rights, responsible business conduct into the headquarters of these companies that have the actual power and leverage to make some of the decisions in order to move this ecosystem towards a rights-respecting one. Just to stress that what is interesting about the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, first of all, of course, they're built on international human rights law, the state duty to protect human rights, and there within also the duty of the state to require tech companies to respect human rights. They don't necessarily say that this is the only way to do so by legislation, by hard law, but they also speak about accompanying measures, voluntary measures, and there are some activities that the state can take in terms of export credit agencies and so forth, also not using only the stick, but also using the carrot. And it's very important to also emphasize that even in jurisdiction where a hard law doesn't exist, companies have an independent responsibility to respect human rights. And I'm just again pointing to this taxonomy that we published because it really allows to anchor this debate around AI harms within the international agreed framework of human rights, within the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that exists since 1948. What we are seeing so far in terms of, I mean, BTech really engages very closely with the human rights teams within some of these big tech companies. Often these human rights teams also have to compete against different interests within the company, right? They have to make their case why human rights need to be an informing voice for many product and service decisions. And we see that, I mean, there is some progress. At the same time, the risk assessment often at the moment lags behind the technological progress, right? The product pipelines are extremely fast, and sometimes building the human rights considerations into the product pipelines can be difficult. And that's why legislation can, of course, be an additional motivating factor, so to speak, in order to doing so, even though business interests might not be the ones that would speak for additional human rights integration. There is also a lot of work that we've been doing around technical standard setting, really working with organizations such as ISOC, IEEE, understanding how also technical standard setting can inform such choices that companies make, and can also manifest how human rights can inform technical standard setting processes. We're just emerging on the other end from the AI for Good summit that ITU hosted in Geneva last week. And there were a lot of panels that actually reinforce that message that human rights need to be built into the products. They can't be like a satellite consideration. And I invite everyone to look at some of the recordings from that very important week.
Thank you so much. I cannot agree more that human rights needs to be built in with the project, right? Like not a secondary talk. I wanted to let you know that your taxonomy is famous because a lot of people in the chat was asking for it. So we have shared with our audience, and hopefully people will continue to spread that around. Thank you so much for mentioning it. I want to go back to Meredith, because I think we one of the topics, like one of our missions in this conversation is also try to answer the question about what legislators are missing. So what are they missing? What would be the top 3 things for them to consider when building such a legislation? What would you like to share on that?
So if I had to pick 3, I would say first, the need for more meaningful transparency and stakeholder engagement in line with the UN guiding principles that Isabel has been talking about. Second, the need for intersectional analysis. And third, something that Tesh mentioned, that governments themselves need to take more responsibility as critical actors within the value chain, as tech investors, as tech developers, and tech deployers for public services. Oh, and actually, I'm going to cheat and add a 4th one. I would say that governments need to take stronger stances on what technologies or AI systems are fundamentally incompatible with international law or just unacceptable for our democratic societies. So I'll try to go through these relatively quickly. The first one, stakeholder engagement and transparency. I already talked a bit about the Resource Center's experience in contacting tech companies about their involvement in Israel and Palestine and the lack of responsiveness. But this lack of responsiveness from the tech sector is also a general trend. Over a 10-year period, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center has invited over 330 technology companies to respond to over 720 human rights allegations raised by civil society organizations and the media. And the response rate is 48%. So that's notably much less than other sectors like apparel and textile and natural resources, despite the very large impact that tech has around the world and particularly on at-risk groups. My colleague, Danny Raymond, has been doing amazing work in analyzing our company response requests and the responses that we've received. And of those that we're sending to tech companies, nearly 1/3 of the invitations are related to tech company operations in conflict-affected zones, including Myanmar, Israel and Gaza, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, among others. And for those that are related to conflict, 80% are allegations linked to tech companies headquartered in the global north, impacting the global majority. So transparency is the first step towards accountability, and tech companies are not hitting the mark, especially when it comes to conflict, which is when they should be doing and saying even more. And legislation should be putting more pressure on companies to meaningfully engage with civil society and be more transparent. The second, intersectional analysis. So as we know, it's important to understand the harms, including those experienced by people living in conflict-affected areas, people with disabilities, children, women, racialized groups, linguistic minorities, and those living in global majority countries when translating these new laws and directives into national legislation. Because of course, impacts will be different for every individual and no region or country exists in isolation. A number of NGOs, including Fundación Charisma or Transparencia Brazil and others, published a statement about the EU AI Act's lack of consideration for the global majority, which you can post in the chat, and it's definitely worth a read. And the Resource Center also published a piece recently about engagement, remedy, and justice for global majority workers and the CSDDD in the EU. So I'm happy to share both of those pieces. The third point about governments themselves taking more responsibility as actors within the tech value chain. Governments are developing their own in-house technologies, and we often have little evidence of how they're carrying out or if they're carrying out human rights due diligence. So a first semblance of a positive step in this regard was the Biden administration's executive order on spyware, but we're still waiting to see exactly how this is implemented. But a very obvious example too is how unchecked and overhyped military and defense tech are causing huge problems. The government is also investing in tech companies with our taxpayer dollars, whether it be through pensions or procurement, and they're deploying technology when carrying out their daily jobs or attempting to make public services more accessible. So governments really need to look at their own relationship with technology and tech companies more critically and use their leverage as investors and key stakeholders in the value chain to influence corporate behavior beyond just their legislative and regulatory obligations. And the Danish Institute for Human Rights has a great new publication about public procurement and digital technologies, which I'll also share. I owe you all a lot of links. But the fourth one, super quickly to wrap up, about taking a stronger stance about what we will and will not accept as a society. Through the EU AI Act, there's now the beginning of a no-go or unacceptable risk list. And governments should really consider this list, governments around the world, and expand it, especially when tech business models are fundamentally incompatible with international law or what we want for ourselves and future generations, or when the capabilities of the technology itself are not proportionate to the desired aims of what they're marketing themselves as. Spyware is another top of mind example. So, and governments should really be actively consulting civil society in making and continually updating such lists. So those are my top four.
Thank you so much. Also, everybody on the audience are loving the links and the extra resources that you're all sharing, so keep them coming. I think we still have a few minutes for final comments, not too long, but like we might have around 2 minutes for everybody, any one of you who would like to share your final thoughts on the discussion, maybe something I haven't addressed that you would like to share with folks. So maybe can we get it started? I will start with Tesh, and then I will call people around and we can share a couple minutes of final comments and thoughts on this topic.
Final comments. Okay, sorry. For me, I used to make fun about that I've been in the wrong side, but as a big data engineer, and now I'm in the good side. But I think we need to break these biases or this wall between science and humanistic, like we would say science as well. Because the problem of so much models right now, so many software on the market and stuff like that, it's because there wasn't intersectional vision behind all these developments. So many companies are delivering software right now because there is no regulation. So when companies or when right wings, especially in Spain or in the EU Parliament, says okay, we are by using regulation, we are stopping development, we are stopping innovation. that is a lie. So please, we need to think that this is like a machine. We need to regulate. We need to have more multidisciplinary thinkers and developers and humanistic people thinking about what's gonna be, what's wrong with AI. It's not bad, of course. I am big fan of technology, of course, as a software engineer, but I think sometimes we need to think what's going on and think in policies for decades, because right now everyone is delivering their regulation or their opinion about something specific, especially I'm talking about Spain, when we focus a lot, or we are focusing a lot now in AI, addressing AI and porn revenge, but we need to make an umbrella policies that can be alive or at least be an advance for a decade. And then a thing that I'm most wondering about is about borders. You mentioned it before. Human rights and special groups like migration, women, children are the target of AI and big companies. And I think we need to be aware and put the spotlight on that. And third thing, for me, this is going to be the atomic bomb. I don't know if it's the same in English, but I think AI is used now not only in Palestine. We are using Palestine as a small laboratory, but there is so much investment, especially in Spain and in other countries, on military industry using AI, and they are putting a lot of money on this. So we need to focus. We need to put spotlight on that, because it's not only against another countries. They're gonna use it in EU in EU citizens, and I think that is something we have and we must to be aware. And we need, of course, more like tech policymakers and not only politicians on this side.
Thank you so much. Isabel, do you want to share any final comments?
Yeah, thanks, Isabella. And I think I connect to what Tesh said. I think, the best conversation usually happen when we combine expertise from different disciplines, when we combine the policymakers, the human rights lawyers, the actual data scientists, and then those people who have also experience in how you actually enforce laws in an efficient way and manner. Because I think even though the AI Act is now in place, and for example, also the Digital Services Act, we still need to make sure that these legislations are implemented in a way that they actually protect human rights, and that can only happen if we understand the actual human rights risks properly, and then can also identify measures that actually allow us to mitigate those risks. And this is why all these multidisciplinary fora, working groups, red teaming are really essential in ensuring that we don't only have a paper tiger, but we actually use legislation in order to protect the rights holders, because that's what, in the end, for example, what the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are about, really applying a lens to the severity of the potential risk to people and prioritizing mitigation measures based on that risk.
Thank you so much. I will go to you, James. Do you want to share last thoughts?
Yeah, sure. It's been lots of very interesting thoughts from the other panelists. I agree with, sorry, I forgot your name, but your previous panelist who was talking about how it's not just, I think sometimes when we think of governance, we think of regulations, laws, which are obviously very important, but governments also need to use the whole, toolbox of targeted investments, procurement guidelines, education, training, all of those things that get the institutional design right to make sure that institutions are also fit to govern AI. For instance, we've got a piece of work at the moment with the Dutch Digital Infrastructure Authority. It's a European Commission project to help build their kind of competencies and capacities of competent authorities for AI. To help implement the EU AI Act, other EU digital legislation and standards like the UNESCO recommendation. So I think it's, not just, sometimes I think it can be tempting to think of regulation as a kind of silver bullet, but it's actually, the whole panoply of different measures that can really that have to be brought to bear to take on the challenges from AI. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Meredith, you would like to share your last comments?
Yeah, thanks. I think, I just love the way that Dr. Djibril put it when she said that everything that's happening is a political choice. It's not an inevitable state of affairs. And, in monitoring the tech sector, we're seeing that way beyond weapons, right? Telecommunications providers, surveillance tech, social media companies, chips manufacturers, they're all becoming increasingly integrated and intertwined into conflict and impacting people's lives in sometimes very extreme ways. So I would encourage more tech companies and tech investors to join these multi-stakeholder spaces so that we can work together on preventing that AI further dilutes accountability both in peacetime and during conflict. And I want to thank Isabel and Isabella and James and Tesh for this great panel discussion, and to Hamla for organizing.
I would like to thank everybody. This has been a great discussion. I'm extreme bias here. I'm Brazilian to begin with. We have a lot of debates on legislation, so I understand a lot of the pain in this process, right? Like especially with uneducated legislators. Also work on the tech industry, so I understand from within the pain of seeing the companies that you're working for committing enormous errors or like deciding on terrible things. And I'm really happy to see, as Meredith mentioned, like tech workers, right, like standing up and working and bringing, right, like accountability from within. But I'm also I direct a tech organization, and our mission is to advance human rights. So we take that to the whole, like to the soul of the work that we do and everything that we do. And I would love to see, right, like the other counterparts, like in the sector, thinking in the same way, participating on the dialogue, as has been mentioned. I really appreciate the work that UNESCO is doing, right? Like in helping building some type of guide that could help the legislator understand this process and make right decisions. So yes, it has been a really great panel. I think we all learned a lot. I appreciate your sharing, also sharing the resources. Our audience have enjoyed very much. So thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.